Bourne Conspiracy is a game released in 2008 by High Moon Studios, a development team with a pretty strong track record that extends back to the early 2000s and right up to the present day, where they toil away in the Activision COD mines. But before all that, they released a few pretty well-received Transformers games, and this, the Bourne Conspiracy, a game based on the film IP we all know and love as the Matt Damon-led action thriller, which is by all accounts a widely successful franchise and one that basically rewrote the rules of modern action movies, so no pressure there. While the films have a strong trilogy and a couple of sequels that, exist, it was interesting to me as an enjoyer of these films that there was a game based on the universe. And back in 2008, it entirely passed me by for one reason or another, so I suppose you could say that I've had it in my backlog for a while, actually nearly 20 years. So what's it all about? Is it worth playing today? Is it a credit to the films? And I know what you're thinking. That's a pretty contentious title for a well-regarded cult classic, so hopefully I'll answer all of those questions and take you along on the ride through espionage, action, and the uncanny valley just as usual. Right then, I suppose it makes sense to explain where Conspiracy stands in the universe, because despite the lack of Matt Damon, it does actually have the blessing of the author of the novels, so it might not be obvious, and to be honest, I wasn't even 100% sure even after finishing the game. So, the game more or less follows the events of the first film, the Bourne Identity, and it isn't actually considered a direct movie tie-in, not least because it released a year after the third film, but because it obviously doesn't have Matt Damon, and does indeed change a few things, though if you're familiar with the film, you'll recognise the basic framework. Either way, it's treated as a expanded universe spin-off, and it hasn't been referred to in any of the films that came after it, so it's firmly in a different universe, but the same type of territory, if that makes any sense. And to be honest, that makes me a little bit curious about the original intention, because it sounds like High Moon wanted or expected to have Matt's likeness, and it obviously follows Identity in its broad strokes from a story perspective, so my theory is that this was meant to be more of a direct tie-in to the universe, and possibly the start of a new game trilogy, who knows. But apparently Matt Damon didn't want to lend his face to a shooting game, so that lands us here. And anyway, I don't want to get bogged down in all this shit, so let's just talk about the game, shall we? So, the gameplay is actually quite unique, because although on paper it's a traditional third-person action game, the way it blends shooting and hand-to-hand combat is a little bit unusual. Unlike in Gears of War or pretty much any other third-person game where you shoot, move, and melee, Conspiracy divides the melee part into its own slice of gameplay, which is separate from the shooting. So when you're engaged in hand-to-hand combat, the perspective shifts from over the shoulder to what's almost like a Mortal Kombat type thing, but that's obviously not a perfect translation. And because the Bourne films are famous for their hand-to-hand fight scenes, the game tries to make this part of the gameplay more of a feature rather than something you can just do, if that makes sense. So instead of just swinging your gun and hitting someone, you're thrown into these more methodical, and I suppose you could say on-rails fight scenes, because you're in them and you can't pull out of them without winning the fight, which is definitely a bit weird. And honestly, it's a part of the game which does, at least on paper, live up to the film's pedigree of having visceral hand-to-hand action that puts you there. And in the game, it's certainly not the worst combat system I've ever seen, but the way it's separate from the whole shooting aspect is definitely a little bit odd and something that takes a bit of getting used to. Specifically, it feels a bit clunky when you're in a gunfight, but you get a bit too close, because the hand-to-hand action isn't something you choose, it's something that happens whenever you're too close or in the proximity of an enemy. So you go from over-the-shoulder shooting to punching immediately when you walk next to someone, whether you've got your gun out or not. And near the start of the game, my instincts were to pull out of these hand-to-hand fights and just shoot them instead. But no, like I already said, you can't cancel these fights or move away from them, you've got to win it, or, well, lose it and restart your checkpoint. The whole system is a little bit too rigid for my liking. At first, these two different combat systems might feel a bit formulaic because of how you're not necessarily choosing one or the other, but instead thrust into one or the other based on how the gameplay is unfolding in front of you. There'll be sections of the game where you'll be shooting 90% of the time, and there's missions where you'll be fighting 90% of the time, and of course there's obviously ones where it's a bit of a mix. And what ends up happening is that the game comes at you in these blocks of action, and you don't really get to adapt or have a chance to do something your own way. If you're in a corridor, you're probably going to be punching, and if you're in a bigger arena, you're probably going to be shooting. It strips away a bit of your agency and makes the game feel like, as I've already said, a series of events that's just sort of happening, and one that you play through as the game intends, which I suppose does fit the game because it is indeed a linear campaign. But this rigid section-by-section structure takes away the human weapon vibe that the game is meant to be making you inhabit, and puts it more so on rails, even if you're not exactly on a track, if that makes any sort of sense. Films take us to places and show us things, and while games obviously do that too, they also provide you an input and agency to inhabit what's unfolding. And I think where Conspiracy falls down is by adhering too closely to the show and the tell, rather than providing the player a toolbox to play through it. Which isn't actually a surprise, I guess, because it's obviously retelling the narrative of a film, and doing it in a way which wants to pay respect to the source material. But what you end up with in practice is gameplay that you don't really have much agency over, and lots of interactive cinematics where you're literally just pressing one button and the rest, well, just happens, and that's throughout the whole game. Even when you're in gameplay and not watching one of these cinematics, the whole press one button thing is still pretty well the backbone. You've got this meter on the side of the minimap that fills up when you land hits, kill someone, or block punches. It spawns adrenaline, and when you've got enough, you can use it to do a few things. All pretty much the same, but take a different amount of adrenaline. You can do a single takedown, multiple takedowns, and a shooting takedown, which, again, you can do to one guy or multiple. The issue is, though, they're all the same. You press B when you've got enough adrenaline, it switches to a cinematic cam, and you press buttons as they appear, and Bourne does the rest. Now, don't get me wrong, it's well choreographed, it looks pretty cool, and it's definitely got that flashy, visceral action that you'd expect from a film. But really, I don't get much bite out of pressing B and watching it happen. I just wish it was more, I don't know, interactive. Again, I just want to reiterate that I do actually quite like these for what they're worth, and quite enjoyed seeing all the various ways you can dispatch people. And what's cool is how some of them are informed by the environment, so if you're near a wall, you'll throw them against it, and if you're near a sink, you can bet that his head's going through it. It's all very watchable and entertaining, but that's just it. It's watchable, and it happens a lot. And what gameplay you do have full control over, well, has its own set of issues too that I'll elaborate on. The main problem I have with both forms of gameplay is the camera. You'll notice it's pretty damn close to Jason, and while it might give that shaky cam vibe from the films, in a game it just makes it feel more sluggish and claustrophobic almost. It's not exactly like a shooter having a low FOV, but it's in the same ballpark. I found myself getting easily disorientated and not facing the right way after fistfights and shit like that. And again, because you're meant to be this elite super soldier or whatever, bumbling around trying to face the right direction from time to time is all a bit, well, not really elite, let's put it that way. Now, saying that, I wasn't totally put off by it like I would be by low FOV in a shooter, for example, but it's definitely a part of the game that erodes the cinematic intention, because it's obviously meant to be like a film when you see Jason take down guards and when you're in these encounters, but what absolutely isn't like a film is when the camera just ends up inside a wall or clipping through some part of the level in a way that makes it difficult to see what you're doing. Now, this is definitely the main thing that got me thinking the game wasn't cinematic, because it's not just a one-off issue. The whole game is plagued by this absolutely terrible camera placement, and you'll constantly be trying to fight your way out of a corner where you can't see, or fighting from a ceiling where you can't see, or from behind something that you can't see through. It's absolutely ridiculous. And honestly, it isn't just a case of the game being less cinematic, it's a case of literally not being able to see what you're doing in some cases. And on the highest difficulty, that simple fact was just infuriating and ended me up dropping down the difficulty just to get through the game. Not because it's hard, but because you're fighting the camera and the controls as much as you are the enemies, which brings me to the other part of this, which I don't think is so hot. The controls, and you'd probably imagine that it's quite run-of-the-mill because it's a third-person shooter, and that's partly true, but you pair the dodgy camera with not being able to do some simple things like aiming properly, and it makes the game controls feel a little bit floaty and imprecise. Now, you can aim, but the left trigger doesn't tighten your aim, so what you're seeing here is as accurate as you can be, which just feels a bit weird. It's definitely something you can get used to, kind of like everything else, and it's not the end of the world, but the game is just missing some basic quality of life features like aiming and shooting from cover. You have to fully expose yourself to shoot from behind cover, so there's no blind fire, and it just feels a little bit unfinished. And again, it just makes me feel like I'm not fully able to inhabit this trained assassin character, which is a bit of a shame. It's just odd to me that a game which leans so heavily towards the action doesn't have some of these simple and what I'd call quality of life features. And maybe you can put that down to when the game came out, but honestly, there's so many third-person games from pre-2008 that don't have these issues, so that doesn't really wash with me as far as I'm concerned. And I do genuinely think a lot of these things and choices were made to make it all look cinematic, which is kind of ironic because a lot of them are down to the camera, and that's one of the most obvious things in the game, which is kind of funny when you think about it, because the camera is the least cinematic thing about the game, which I guess is the opposite of what they were expecting to do. Now, despite all the shooting and the punching, there is actually a stealth system too, which honestly is really disappointing, because you start out thinking that the game is going to be all Secret Squirrel and Sam Fisher, but honestly, it's not. Being stealthy essentially amounts to just having a pistol with a silencer on it and being able to approach people from behind and to quietly take them out. And as far as I can tell, the game tells you that you can do this in the opening, and then pretty well there's no other opportunity to use it, which, like I said, is a bit disappointing. And even if there were missions where you'd need to be quiet, the stealth is so threadbare that keeping it so would be almost impossible. There's no way of knowing if you've been spotted or might get spotted. You don't have any options like throwing stuff to distract or literally anything. You've got your fists and you've got your gun. That's it. And actually, I think that's a bit of a missed opportunity they could have made the combat more interesting with. I distinctly remember in the film Bourne picking up a magazine and rolling it up to use as a weapon, and then in the same fight brandishing a pen, which is actually something you see in the game, but it would have been really cool if you were able to use all of these random objects as actual weapons and, instead of just punching everyone all the time. Anyway, I'd say that the design of the game pretty well disencourages stealth, despite it being vaguely in the game. Partly because, well, it sort of has to be if you're playing the role of Jason Bourne, but honestly, I think the best Bourne game we might have had is Splinter Cell Conviction, which is just some food for thought, really. Now wait, it ain't all bad though. Like I said about the takedowns, I still find myself enjoying the game. I do actually think, despite everything I've said, Conspiracy is a good time. It's a straightforward action game that doesn't overstay its welcome, taking around 5 or so hours to finish, and it takes you to some pretty varied locations throughout the campaign, and its take on the identity story isn't too bad either, and seeing things from the film in the game was a novelty that didn't really wear off, mostly because it didn't really have time to. But I think that's genuinely a good thing. You get into the game pretty quickly, and you get out of it pretty quick, and you're taken through an action-packed story, which is honestly something I find hard to complain about. The pre-rendered cutscenes are a bit rough, but again, it's almost 20 years old at this point, and I think the framework following a film actually did the storytelling part of the game a service, because it's a tried-and-true story and one that's easy to follow despite all the flashbacks, which honestly was probably done to make the game a bit longer. But overall, as a story package, it's not bad at all. And if you're familiar with the film, you'll get a kick out of it. And if you're not, it's a straightforward 5 or so hour thriller, which is action-packed and easy to follow. Not much more to it, to be honest, and it's really easy to recommend. Which more or less sums up my time with Conspiracy, to be honest. It's got a lot wrong with it, but it also does a lot right. It's action-packed, it's fun, and it's quick. And despite all of the issues with the camera, you're not going to overstay your welcome with this game, and it's definitely worth giving a whirl, especially for, let me just check the case, £2 at CEX. Certainly worth giving a whirl, and if you've seen the films and you're a fan of them, you'll certainly like this game.